Teal'c, today in nerd history. And I mean some actual nerd history as opposed to just talking about the really popular and obvious shit like Sonic, Mario, and Zelda, because hey, you gotta stick with all the stuff that was really, really mainstream, because that's what the biggest demographic of people who are into the geek chic scene understand. You know, those people who in old video game time were actually ripping on the people who did play video games in the 80s and 90s, but have only just discovered that it's the cool and in thing now that it's a multi-million-dollar industry. And with that multi-million-dollar industry and people looking to only just get into it for the first time, while attempting to claim that they've been here all the time, brings us neatly around to all of these accusations that gaming is misogynistic and an old boys club, and all of this sort of nonsense. And today I'm going to introduce you, or reintroduce you, to a British gaming show from the 90s. In fact, it was the first gaming show released in Britain. The very first of its kind. GamesMaster. Now that some of you are done having one of the biggest nostalgic nerdgasms that you've had for a while, let me actually get into the story proper here. GamesMaster was a show that features a format that we're quite familiar with today. In many ways, it was somewhat a trailblazer of its time. It featured 2 or 3 big news stories that would go on throughout the episodes, a few short little cutaway super quick reviews, and a challenge segment. In many ways, it was actually very similar to the format that Top Gear uses these days. And it's a story about this particular challenge segment that I would like to bring up, because I've located an old article from the archives of Eurogamer, which makes for some rather interesting reading. Now, there's a lot of information in this about the general show itself, about a lot of the people who were featured in it that came and went. However, the opening and closing of this article, which is considerably longer than what you're going to see in this video, so I do encourage you to go and read it, features around a young boy named Craig and his sister Kirsty. And while I'm reading through this, I'd like you to keep in mind what we constantly hear from feminists and social justice warriors about how games culture is misogynistic, about how it hates women and wants to keep them out. Something which is rather amusing considering GamesMaster, the first video games show in Britain, was pitched, directed, produced, and generally overseen by a woman by the name of Jane Hewland, pictured here with her son some 2 decades after the show initially aired. But back to the story of Craig and Kirsty, and the earliest instant that totally proves how misogynistic video game culture is. Keep in mind, this is from the 90s. Craig Monroe's 10-year-old heart was pounding in his chest. The unfamiliar controller trembled in his sweaty grip. He stared wide-eyed at the screen, too nervous to blink, too terrified to breathe. Beside him, his elder sister Kirsty hammered the buttons on her own controller like a rabid pianist. Craig watched the numbers tick up. 2, 3, 4. He thought of the letter that had brought him to this moment. The one he had written several months ago to the producers of GamesMaster, his favourite television show. I drew an illustration of some guy from Nintendo World Cup on the NES scoring a goal, the adult Craig remembers today. I thought that would draw them in. He was right. The producers invited Craig and his friend Steve to travel up to London from their native Brighton for an audition, but Steve couldn't make it, so Kirsty went along instead. It was a simple twist of fate that would cast a longer shadow than anyone could have imagined. 5, 6, 7. As the counting continued, Craig realized this had already been the most exciting day of his life. He arrived at the television studio only to discover it wasn't a television studio at all. It was an abandoned power station, he recalls. As a kid, just being allowed in a place like that was amazing. Craig was introduced to his hero, GamesMaster presenter Dominic Diamond. They exchanged some footballing banter. Monroe supports Rangers, Diamond is a Celtic fan. The experience was overwhelming and left a lasting impression on the young gamer. There were disappointments too. There was no sign of the GamesMaster himself, Patrick Moore, and Craig was informed he would not be playing Nintendo World Cup, but a Mega Drive game, Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing. That was a shock to me because I was a Nintendo boy, not a Sega guy, he explains. But Craig was too caught up in the glitz and glamour of video games television to complain. The thing that I was blown away by most was the catering, he said. They gave me a little sticker that meant I could have as much free food as I wanted, so I had about 12 packets of crisps. It was amazing. 8. And now here he was, in the final round of Real Deal, watching Kirsty valiantly but vainly trying to revive her fallen boxer. 9. Craig's whole life had been building up to this moment. He knew that now. 10. The screen flashes scarlet, and that was it. Craig had done it. He had secured the trophy most coveted by every 10-year-old boy in the land. A golden joystick. Okay, said the producer. Let's go for another take. What do you mean? Stammered Craig. I won. His childish protestations fell on deaf ears. He was forced to play a rematch. Spurred on by having victory so callously snatched from his miniature grasp, Craig triumphed again. But then came the call for a third take. Something inside Craig snapped like a shatterproof ruler in the hands of a vigorous fifth former. This time, Kirsty won. Okay, said the producer, that's a wrap. As he recounts the incident today, Craig's eyes flicker with the pain of a man who discovered the truth of the world's cruelty at too tender an age. Basically, they shafted me out of a golden joystick, he says. The cynic in me now realizes they wanted the girl to win. Yeah, he adds bitterly, I think they knew exactly what they were doing. Of course, as I'm sure you can tell from this story, the third take was the one which was aired, and there is a video of it in the box below. He's 29 now and has a child of his own, but that fateful moment when victory was snatched from his grasp feels like it was yesterday. It's the injustice of it all, he says. Craig is convinced the GamesMaster Productions' plan was always to keep filming rematches until his sister won. That sounds absolutely right, says Cameron McAllister, who was one of the show's producers. There is the faintest possibility that we were actually moral. It was just done so much on the cheap, we always had technical problems, but I suspect it made better television for the girl to beat him. Johnny Finch, another producer on the show, is similarly unrepentant. I'm afraid that any take in which the boy is beaten by a girl is going to be the one we'll use, regardless of how much he's going to get bullied at school. Once the GamesMaster's overlord's thirst for the brutal gender-based conflict was sated, it was Craig who had to pick up the bar tab. And that bill is taking longer to pay off than an Animal Crossing mortgage. To this day, people take the piss out of me for losing to my sister on television, he says. There are ongoing repercussions for the siblings' relationships. They have mended the rift, but the join is still visible. Like the place where the two panini stickers meet. The comment by Disco Dancing Kirsty on the YouTube video of their challenge says it all. I'm sorry, Craig, it reads, the author unable to see the shift key through her tears. I'm sorry. Little bit hyperbolic from the author there, but you get the idea. The video, as you will notice, is hosted on Craig's YouTube channel. It was put there some 9 years ago, and the channel seems to be completely dead by now. And the apology from a channel by the name of Kirsty, which has actually since updated to the name Skirty Monroe, a channel which does actually feature some comparatively up-to-date videos, the last one being from a couple of years ago, from a woman who, chronologically and going by the names used, actually is probably the girl who was on the show, so this actually seems to be a legit thing. Does Cameron McAllister have a message for Craig? Get over it, he says. Oh, poor Craig, imagine being beaten by your sister. That's awful. You know what? He won't be alone. There must be hundreds of kids out there who we fucked over. The article goes on for a little bit after this, but not on anything particularly relevant. It just kind of winds down for a couple of paragraphs. I just read through this and found it rather interesting. As I said, there's a lot more in this article than what we've looked at here, But this story, or this part of it, just particularly stood out to me. Because remember, society hates women. Just hates them. It does everything that it can to crush women and girls early on. And misogyny in video games is rampant. And all the men working in tech and video games and computing just do anything that they can to keep women out of it. And yet, in the 90's, in something which was supposed to be a one-play deathmatch, which turned into a best of 3, the girl can win 1 out of 3 games and be declared the winner. Because society hates women and girls and wants to keep them down, and everything about video games is misogynistic. And on top of that, society is just so misogynistic and patriarchal and wants to keep women oppressed so badly that it makes better television and will get better ratings on a video games television program whose primary demographic is going to be boys and young men, to artificially rig the competition so the girl beats the boy. Misogyny indeed.